Hi, I'm Gabby Womack, and I'm a librarian at Merrimack College. Thank you all for watching my presentation. My presentation is an extended version of my grad school thesis, How Fears of Passing Changed the 1930 United States Census. Throughout my presentation, I will be using terms that are now recognized as offensive, but were used in the primary source documents I found. Some of those terms include Negro, the N-word, mulatto, colored, mongrel, amalgamation, and miscegenation. Mulatto, meaning mule, described someone who was of mixed race with black and white ancestry. I will be saying the N-word instead of the actual word, as I do not condone the use of it. Amalgamation in this context means the result of race mixing. Miscegenation is a term that was created in the mid-19th century that means the interbreeding of people considered to be of different racial types. The other terms will be clear within the context of my presentation. I stumbled upon my thesis topic after my grandmother, Andrea Edmonds, showed me this picture of her father, Leroy Edmonds, at work in 1926. She explained that although her father looked like the other white men in this photo, he was actually passing for white. Her sister, Angela Edmonds Brooks, shared that their father omitted his race so that he could get work to support his family. With a growing fascination in my great-grandfather's life, I looked up his census records and was surprised to find that in 1920 he was listed as mulatto, but in 1930 as Negro. After some research, I learned that the Census Bureau changed this classification for all mulattoes in 1930. In changing this classification, the census erased the identities of mixed-race individuals. This presentation argues that mulattoes became Negroes on the 1930 census because white Americans feared that black people were secretly among them, passing for white. Furthermore, it argues that the census change did not end the practice of racial passing or diminish white America's fascination with and fear of this act. Leroy Edmonds was one of the thousands of people who left the South for a better life in the North. An estimated 300,000 African Americans migrated north before 1920. Leaving their hometowns where everybody knew them, African Americans had the opportunity to remake themselves. Those who were mixed race could choose to pass for white to gain employment or do so permanently. People like my great-grandfather were not just coming from the South. There were interracial liaisons, forced and consensual, in New England as well, especially since slavery was not abolished until the late 18th century in Massachusetts, Vermont, Rhode Island, and Maine. Connecticut had gradual abolition, which meant that chattel slavery would not truly be over in the state until 1848. Last year at History Camp, Gabrielle Anzalone and Esme Kimber shared their research on a man named Alexander Twilight. Twilight was a light-skinned African-American educator and a principal who passed for white in Vermont in the 18th century. His parentage is unknown. Lemuel Haynes, an American clergyman, was born from an interracial liaison in Connecticut in 1753. Placed into indentured servitude in Massachusetts as a child, he later fought in the Revolutionary War and married a white woman named Elizabeth Babbitt. Passers were not simply arriving in the North and blending in with white people. Some had been there all along. Patrick Healy arrived in Long Island from the South. He had been born the son of an Irish immigrant planter and an enslaved woman. Due to his mother's condition, Healy and his siblings were all born enslaved to their father. Their father sent 3 of his sons to a Quaker school in Long Island before the Civil War, and they went on to go to school in Worcester, Mass. This technically made them runaway slaves. When the brothers joined the College of Holy Cross, they decided to adopt Catholicism and whiteness. They never reached out to their mother again, despite the fact that she and the other people held in bondage by their father were the ones funding their educations. Although the Catholic Church supported slavery and the belief that black people were inferior to whites, they accepted Patrick and his family. Patrick became a priest in 1864, and later in 1874 was elected the president of Georgetown University. 2 of his brothers also became priests, and 3 of his sisters became nuns. Anita Hemmings grew up in the Roxbury area of Boston, Massachusetts, and was known to be a mulatto. She was accepted to Vassar College despite the fact that the school had never admitted any black students. As graduation was approaching, Hemmings's roommate Louise Taylor told her father that she had suspicions of Anita's background. Taylor's father had Anita and her family investigated, and soon found out that she was not white. He likely notified the college because they began reviewing Hemmings soon after. The Providence Journal reported, a crestfallen Hemmings appealed to the college president with the result that the girl was awarded her diploma. Later, she married a New York doctor who was also passing for white, Dr. Andrew Love. They moved to Manhattan and passed for the rest of their lives. Following in her mother's footsteps, Ellen Love attended Vassar and became their second black graduate in 1927. Although Ellen tracked down the truth about her ancestry in 1923, she applied to Vassar as a white woman. People began to notice and made estimates and claims of the number of mixed-race people passing for white. Newspapers ran stories on how many people they believed were passing every day or year. White people were terrified by the idea of passing, but fascinated by it. Just about everyone knew that people were passing for white, but they most likely didn't know how many people were doing so because it was nearly impossible to trace. This fear and obsession with passing manifested itself in the New York Times articles on the Rhinelander v. Rhinelander case. The newspaper published over 100 articles on Alice Jones Rhinelander and Leonard Kipp Rhinelander in 6 years beginning in 1924. Alice was a mixed-race woman, and Leonard was a white man from a wealthy New York family. In 1924, they got married after 3 years of dating and tried to keep the marriage a secret, but the press found out, and Rhinelander felt forced to end it. Leonard sued Alice for an annulment based on fraud, stating that he did not know she was a mulatto. However, the case made it quite clear that he did. The New York Times described their case in detail, including the letters Alice and Leonard wrote one another. Alice was forced to strip naked to the waist so that the jury could determine whether her true race was discernible. She won the case, but her marriage was ruined, and Leonard filed for divorce in 1929. Similar cases splashed the pages of newspapers in 1910 and 1924. In 1910, the New York Times reported that William Horton was suing his wife Edith for an annulment because she had Negro blood in her veins. In 1924, the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune reported on an annulment suit between Beverly D. Harris and Eleanor Elaine Harris. Beverly claimed that he heard she might be the daughter of a quadroon, someone with 1/4 black ancestry. In 1926, New York State Senator J. Griswold Webb planned to introduce a bill that would make interracial marriage a felony. According to this article, he was inspired by the Rhinelander Jones case and the recent marriage of Sarah Ziegler to Charles Smith, a Negro laborer. The senator from South Carolina planned a bill to create a national ban on interracial marriages in the same year. 1 year later, 6 more states introduced similar legislation. You'll notice that all of them were in the North. Passing was also a popular topic for black and white authors. Between 1920 and 1930, as many as 6 novels featured racial passing. In the novel Passing by Nella Larson, the lead character Irene and her friend Claire can both pass, but only Claire does so permanently, to her own detriment. Claire's white husband Jack doesn't seem to have a clue that his wife is black. In fact, he refers to her as Nig as a joke, explaining, "When we first married, she was as white as a lily, but I declare she's getting darker and darker. I tell her if she don't look out, she'll wake up one of these days and find she's turned into an N-word." At one point, Irene is anxious that someone may realize that she's passing, but quickly brushes it off, thinking, "White people were so stupid about such things for all they usually asserted that they were able to tell, by fingernails, palms of hands, shapes of ears, teeth, and other equally silly rot." In many books, people claimed the best way to find out if someone is passing is to check their nails for dark or bluish half-moons. This assumption was used as evidence in scientific racism. Scientific racism is a pseudoscience that used physical markers and skewed mental tests to claim racial superiority for white people. There were distinctions between Europeans, Africans, Asians, and Indians, as well as subspecies within the European white race. Thomas Jefferson had common, yet notable views on race and amalgamation. One of his most famously quoted works, Notes on the State of Virginia, depicts his belief at the time that blacks are inferior to whites in the endowment both of body and mind. Many black pioneers, some mixed race, sent their works to Jefferson in the hopes that he would realize that their people were as talented and intelligent as any white person. Some historians claimed that it is possible Jefferson simply saw many of them as having received their aptitude from their white blood. Ironically, years after Jefferson's slave, Sally Hemmings, gave birth to her sixth child by Jefferson, he wrote to his friend Edward Coles, in regards to black Americans, that their amalgamation with the other color produces a degradation to which no lover of this country, no lover of excellence and the human character, can innocently consent. Jefferson's views on race are interesting, seeing as many of his descendants with Sally Hemings went on to pass for white, and are nearly impossible to trace. Henry Moss was not passing for white, but just as the skin of passers complicated the concept of race, so too did Henry Moss's skin condition. In 1803, Henry Moss, a 46-year-old African-American man, was visiting Providence. It appeared that Moss was becoming white. Today, his condition would be diagnosed as vitiligo. In 1803, this was a shocking and fascinating transition. Moss called on anti-slavery activist Moses Brown, who examined his skin. President Washington and Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State, were also intrigued and decided to examine Moss's condition. Brown concluded that Moss's skin was evidence that people were all the same. God hath made of one blood all nations of men. For we see in him one and the same blood sustains a man that appears to our sense both black and white. Not every Northerner agreed with Moses Brown's sentiments on the equality of men. Madison Grant of New York City, with degrees from Columbia and Yale University, wrote books that he claimed demonstrated the supremacy of men with European ancestry. Lothrop Stoddard of Brookline, Massachusetts, with degrees from Harvard and Boston University, wrote a book warning of the horrors of people of color outpopulating whites. The following quotes by eugenicists Madison Grant and Lothrop Stoddard, respectively, sum up their beliefs of mixed-race people. The unfortunate fact that nearly all species of men interbreed freely leaves us no choice in the matter. The races must be kept apart by artificial devices, or else they ultimately amalgamate, and in the offspring, the lower type prevails. When Negroes or Amerindians have offspring with whites, the result is a mechanical mixture, or a mongrel, so consumed by his jarring heredities that he is quite worthless. Grant's book would go on to become Adolf Hitler's Bible. In order to prevent and/or discourage these unnatural liaisons, states created anti-miscegenation laws. As anti-miscegenation laws were revised, drafted, and legislated in many states, it became important to have rules of racial classification. These laws worked in tandem with the one-drop rule. The one-drop rule was the belief that if a person of mixed ancestry had even a small percentage of black blood, they were black. Between 1910 and 1930, 9 states passed one-drop type statutes, while 8 others had similar laws. Walter Plecker drove Virginia to pass the Act to Preserve Racial Integrity in 1924. He was often worrying that blacks were attempting to pass as white. The new law only defined the 2 races, white and colored. The United States Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which forbade miscegenation on the grounds that racial mixing was scientifically unsound and would pollute America with mixed-blood offspring. In 1940, Plecker admitted that the test to determine the race of an individual did not exist. Segregation kept the races apart by law in every way possible, from bathrooms to schools to building entrances and doctors' offices. The accommodations for coloreds were always lesser than those for whites, so that it is quite clear that white people were widely accepted as superior and deserving of their privileges. Segregation and anti-miscegenation laws spread across the country, and confusion around racial classification led the U.S. Census Bureau to adopt the one-drop rule. In 1930, census enumerators were instructed to record mulattoes as Negroes, erasing any distinctions in mixed-race people. Did the census change actually solve anything? Did white Americans stop fearing passers? In order to answer those questions, I will dive into the new medium of film to analyze passing and censorship. In the 1930s and 40s, 6 films about passing debuted. For the purpose of my presentation, I'll analyze 4 of them: Veiled Aristocrats, Imitation of Life, Lost Boundaries, and Pinky. A black director named Oscar Micheaux directed Veiled Aristocrats, which he adapted from the novel The House Behind the Cedars by Charles W. Chestnut. Oscar Micheaux released a film before this also titled The House Behind the Cedars, but it was heavily censored. In this revised version, the main character John Walden has returned home after 20 years of passing as a white lawyer. His mother, Molly, insists that his sister Raina's relationship with a dark-skinned man named Frank would not benefit her, so they push her to pass for white with her brother. An upper-class man named George falls in love with Raina, and she rejects his proposal, as well as her own whiteness. She returns home to marry Frank. This is the only film out of the 4 that had an all-colored cast. Imitation of Life was a film based on the Fannie Hurst novel of the same name. In this film, Bea Pullman is a white widowed mother in need of help. Delilah Johnson appears just in time with her daughter Paola, a light-skinned little girl. Delilah and Paola stay by Bea's side as she goes from struggling widow to successful business owner using Delilah's pancake recipe. As Paola gets older, she struggles with her identity because she looks white, but she knows she's black. She crosses into the white fold in an attempt to leave her blackness behind, until tragedy strikes her mother and pushes Paola to accept herself as Negro. Lost Boundaries was meant to depict the true story of the Johnston family from Keene, New Hampshire, who passed for white for 20 years. The film centers around the Carter family's normal life in the fictional town of Keenum until Scott Carter and Marcia Carter feel pressured to reveal to their unsuspecting children that they are colored. Their eldest son, Howard, has a breakdown and tries to understand what it means to be black, while Scott begins to regret his decision to pass. Eventually, the white town comes to accept the family after hearing the truth. Lost Boundaries, the film, was based on a book by the same name, by William White. White wrote about the Johnston family of Keene, New Hampshire. In the chapter Release, White shows the ways in which each of the Johnston children felt about being openly black. They describe the differences in the attitudes of their friends and community. Albert Jr. shares that although the town was still treating them well, he could no longer date the white girls in town because their families would not allow it. Even in tolerant New England, intolerance rises when marital relations are involved, he explained. Albert's sister also expressed dismay when she was discussing a story about the Southern lynching in that day's paper with 3 other kids. One of them, the valedictorian of her high school, said, "Of course Negroes are okay, but keep them in their place." He went on to say that even though Lena Horne is good-looking, he wouldn't marry her or any of them because it would be so awful bringing up children and not knowing what color they would be. The next film, Pinky, is the story of a light-skinned woman returning south to her granny, Dicey. In the north, she trained to become a nurse and fell in love with a white doctor. She admits to passing for white, explaining that it was an accident at first. Dicey asks Pinky to take care of her friend, a stubborn, mean old white lady who lives in the rundown plantation nearby. Pinky hates the old woman at first, but as they get to know each other, both of their prejudices melt away. When the old woman dies, she gives her plantation to Pinky, leaving Pinky to decide between staying in the South or marrying her white lover and moving west. Pinky decides to fight for her right to the plantation and turns down the opportunity to pass. All of these films faced censorship in Hollywood or from cities across America for displaying these examples of miscegenation. Hollywood attempted to censor Imitation of Life simply for having a character who was clearly the result of miscegenation. The Atlanta Censorship Board prohibited movie houses from playing Pinky and Lost Boundaries. In the Albert C. Johnston collection at Cheshire County Historical Society, I found a record of Lost Boundaries' censorship case. In their court case against the distributors of Lost Boundaries, the Atlanta Censorship Board claimed that Lost Boundaries violated provisions of the city's ordinances, which stated that they cannot show a film if it will adversely affect the peace, morals, and good order of said city. The Atlanta Censorship Board allowed the theaters to show Pinky with the removal of a few scenes, which included white men who pursued Pinky even after finding out her race. In the end, Pinky still upheld segregation by opening the plantation as a black nursing school and clinic. Lost Boundaries, on the other hand, allows the white passing family to continue living and working in the white town and even display the above sign in a clinic that Scott Carter and his colleague run. It promoted desegregation, and they believed it would spark racial unrest. These films faced censorship because miscegenation was against the law, and segregation was the law of the land. However, they got a better reception from their audiences. The first two films starred mixed-race actresses, but the last two chose white actors in order to try and get whites to relate to the stories more. Imitation of Life, Lost Boundaries, and Pinky received mixed reviews of praise and skepticism from white and black viewers, while Veiled Aristocrats faded into the background. It is likely that having a black director and all-colored cast may have kept Veiled Aristocrats from getting a wider viewership. While the films garnered plenty of success, Walter White of the NAACP claimed that the Southerners were not fans of the criticisms they sensed in these films. In the 1920s, white America's fear and fascination of passers manifested itself in newspapers and novels. Lawmakers and eventually the Census Bureau attempted to quell this fear by pushing mulattoes and thus passers into blackness. However, the films of the 30s and 40s proved that not even the Census Bureau could stop racial passing and decrease white America's obsession with it. As long as inequality exists, so will passing. This presentation is about the census and passing, but it's also an example of how fear can affect policy, censorship, and our lives. Feel free to leave questions in the comment section or email me. For right now, I want to share a few extra things I learned while doing my research. In the section about Anita Hemmings, I mentioned that her roommate, Louise Taylor, outed her, but I did not mention that her daughter, Ellen Hemmings, was also outed by Louise Taylor. Louise Taylor sent many letters of complaint to the college's president at the time, but he was unfazed by her complaints and decided to allow Ellen Love to continue going to the school since she was technically a legacy student. He also stated that he believed she did not know she was black and she was given her own separate room. If you're curious to know if Anita Hemmings was related to Sally Hemings of Monticello, according to Monticello.org, Jill Sims, the granddaughter of Anita Hemmings, cannot say with certainty that she is descended from Elizabeth Hemmings' son Peter Hemmings, a Monticello cook and brewer who also worked as a tailor after he became free in 1827, purchased by a relative at the Monticello sale. Thank you for watching my presentation. Let me know what you think or if you have any questions, and I hope you enjoyed this.